Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's August 3, 2020, and today we're speaking with Kirt Mausert, PhD student in anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley. Hello, Kirt.
Hello, Luke. Thanks for having me. It's good to be back.
My pleasure, yeah. It's been 3.5 years since your last appearance on the podcast, and it's great to have you back. So, Myanmar has around 55 million people. Something like 37 million people are enrolled to vote, and yet huge areas in the country are experiencing armed conflict, have long-term internet blackouts, or are peaceful but not actually governed by the Myanmar state, even though on the map those areas are ostensibly in Myanmar. And then there are the Rohingya, who are the people that Kirt researches on and with. Now, the Rohingya have suffered probably the most of any group of people in Myanmar since the beginning of the so-called democratic reforms in October 2016 and then August 2017. The Myanmar military, the Tatmadaw, responded to small-scale attacks in Rakhine State with full-scale attacks on civilians, forcing more than 800,000 Rohingya people to flee into neighbouring Bangladesh. There are still 600,000 Rohingya left in Western Myanmar and Yangon and elsewhere. Maybe we can get into the issue of the vote and who gets to vote and why in Myanmar by talking about who the Rohingya are. Will the Rohingya get to vote, and should they get to vote, and how can they get to vote?
The Rohingya are a minority group that comes from Arakan, now more commonly known as Rakhine State. And I think people, your listeners in the world, are generally very familiar with them as the targets of state-sponsored persecution, including genocide. And their position with respect to this election is going to be a big question going forward, especially with proceedings against Myanmar unfolding with respect to the genocidal persecution of the group over the last at least 8 years, if not arguably longer, since that genocide is not simply a matter of armed conflict or violence, but also of structural and systematic oppression and discrimination, which has included the exclusion of Rohingya from elections, from being allowed to represent their own interests at the level of the state in parliament. Although they were members of parliament after the election in 2010, there were a number of Rohingya who were elected to parliament to represent their communities as members of the USDP, the military's proxy political party. Shui Mong, for example, was allowed to run as a USDP member and was elected, but was then subsequently denied the opportunity to contest the election in 2015 independently. So right now there are calls from Rohingya political parties, most notably the DHRP, which contested elections in 1990 and had a number of candidates who were elected then, but of course who could not sit in parliament as those election results were not recognized and honored by military. And there are presently a number of candidates that they are putting up or trying to get included on the voter rolls and registration to be able to run. But it's an open question as to whether or not they will be allowed, because the white card, which was invalidated, effectively allowed to expire under the Thein Sein administration, is forming the basis of their claim to be allowed to participate. And the NLD government, this government, has not indicated any willingness to accept that demand so far as we've seen up to this point.
This may be a naive question, but some refugee populations do manage to vote. For example, people who fled Afghanistan and are in camps where there is a large presence of international humanitarian organizations. A lot of effort is put into getting them to vote in national elections of their home country. Will that is that possible for the Rohingya, who are only a matter of kilometers from Myanmar, but have been pushed there partly because there seems to be this belief in Myanmar that they are not citizens. So, what is the situation with these Rohingya who have been forced from their homes where they were born and are just over the border of Myanmar? Nearly around 250,000 potential votes in this group of people.
Right. There's no real practical justification for excluding the Rohingya from the elections. There are UN organizations who are managing these camps and have been engaged in implementing camp-level elections and processes to include Rohingya refugees in the administration of the camps. So, including issuing forms of ID that are based on a biometric system. So, there's really no practical limitation in terms of including people, allowing them to vote. But there is, of course, a huge political hurdle in that Myanmar continues to reject any suggestion that that Rohingya refugees are entitled to vote. And it's very unlikely, I think, that that's going to change in the short term, both for refugees who are now stuck in the camps in Bangladesh or in Myanmar, where there are still anywhere between 300 and 600,000 Rohingya, including in their traditional villages. Still, there are some Rohingya there, and many of the people there who are in their traditional villages are folks who did hold white cards, which were a kind of replacement for NRCs after the 1982 citizenship law effectively and arbitrarily stripped Rohingya of their ability to fully participate in Myanmar's political systems. The national registration cards are a basis for being included on the voter rolls. So holding one of these cards is crucial to being included on the voting rolls and being able to stand for and vote in elections. And virtually all Rohingya lost these cards through the state's arbitrary exclusion that was crafted really ultimately to exclude Rohingya specifically. Some of the language in that 1982 citizenship law was proposed by Rakhine nationalists, and including the provision about 1823 being the particular cutoff point for being recognized as an indigenous citizen. So there was really quite a deliberate effort to structure that law around excluding the Rohingya in particular. And it's been very effective in that, obviously. But what has happened is rather than outright exclude Rohingya, there was a process of these kinds of partial steps towards, we will evaluate you, we will ascertain your basis for being included as a citizen. And the white cards were meant to be a kind of placeholder for this process, but they were ultimately allowed to expire and become invalidated during the Thein Sein administration around a controversy related to participation in a constitutional referendum that never actually materialized. And that became the basis then for excluding Rohingya from the election in 2015, and which is why today, of course, we see not only no Rohingya in government, but there are no Muslims in the legislature either. So the controversy around participation in that referendum was driven by hardline Buddhist ethno-nationalists, including Rakhine nationalists, who were outraged at the prospect of Rohingya who had voted in 1990 and in 2010 and in the 2008 constitutional referendum, outraged at the prospect that people who they viewed as foreign interlopers would participate in something as consequential as a constitutional referendum and in the general election that was held later in that year in 2015. So that point in the spring of 2015 became a really pivotal point in cementing the disenfranchisement of the Rohingya en masse. And today, the Rohingya political parties like the DHRP are calling for white card holders to be included in the election. But while they may hold the white cards, they have been legally disqualified. The white card's validity was allowed to expire at the end of March in 2015. So holding the card has no real legal validity. So the state has continued to, this government has continued to insist that there's no possibility, as far as we can see, there's no possibility that unless there's a big change in the government's position on the validity of these documents, that Rohingya will be allowed to participate both as voters and candidates in the coming election.
Periodically, we hear from the NLD and from others in the government and the military in Myanmar that the Rohingya are free to come home, that they can be repatriated, although they are not referred to as Rohingya, they are referred to as Bengalis. So how does this factor in repatriation?
That's a good question. I think the issue of repatriation certainly has consequences for the future of any democratic or any attempt to establish democratic norms and institutions in Myanmar, because the Rohingya made up a sizable chunk of the electorate in Rakhine State. Crucially, they made up a majority of northern Rakhine State. And were they allowed to remain in Myanmar, not be subjected to genocide, and to vote, they would definitely have representation in both the state level and the national level. The districts in northern Rakhine State were overwhelmingly Rohingya, a majority. So that's a political reality that is utterly anathema to the AMP, the main Rakhine party in Rakhine State, and anathema, of course, to a great number of Burmese across the country who are opposed to the idea that Rohingya have any legitimate place in the country, certainly as co-equals, but even as second or third class citizens. So repatriation seems very far-fetched at this point, and the participation of Rohingya refugees who are now in Bangladesh, it's not clear how their participation would potentially play out. Would they be voting in the districts that they came from? Because, of course, these folks all know where they've come from. They know their villages, which districts they had voted in before. So, but would they be voting as a block? Would they be voting in where they were registered before? And of course, the government has household registration lists for Rohingya. The idea that they are undocumented is a complete misconception. Rohingya are some of the most documented people in Myanmar, ironically. There are household registration lists down to livestock that the government holds on to and has had for decades. So it's completely inaccurate to say that the state and the government don't know who people are. The claim that, oh, well, some of them might be interlopers we don't know is a very disingenuous line, given the stringent and detailed records that the government has kept for many decades. In many cases, they have issued documents to folks, and then they've collected them later only to return nothing. So what they've done with those documents, the white cards, no one really knows. Many Rohingya who did not trust that whole process of returning documents on the promise that they would be given a replacement have held on to their NRCs from many decades ago and other documentation, and keep them with them in Bangladesh. And I've met with people in the camps who are very keen to share and show you the documentation that they have, documents that show that people were civil servants, people were teachers, lawyers, that they have official documents that show that they were in fact citizens of the country. So the idea that the Rohingya are quote unquote stateless is misleading. The Rohingya have been rendered stateless through a process of extirpation and erasure and genocide, but it's not a matter of not knowing who is who or where people came from. The issue is strictly a matter of wanting to exclude people on the basis of preventing a block forming in northern Rakhine State, where the Rohingya were a majority and would have been assured a place in both national and regional parliaments, were they allowed to continue to be enfranchised and vote and contest elections. And there are analogies to what's happening here in America, I think, that you can draw. And the resentment that you saw in the mid 20th century when voting rights were extended to African Americans. Of course, white Southerners, switched their allegiance from one political party to another, from, Democrats to becoming Republicans, on the basis of resenting the extension of the franchise to African Americans. And there's a similar issue in Rakhine State where we struggle with this in America. We're still dealing with it in a very serious way. And so, of course, in Rakhine State, we can't expect, that change will happen overnight. But there is a real issue here between, recognizing Rohingya as categorical co-equals who would be able to represent their own interests in a significant way at both state and national levels, were they allowed to participate in elections freely as citizens, which they have been before, when it suited the interests of the state, both in the UNU period and under the military's rule, when they wanted to hold the 2008 referendum, when they held the 2010 election. They were happy to extend the franchise under those circumstances. But the sea change has really only come, or rather has really taken a much sharper turn following the outbreak of violence in 2012, at which point this became a national controversy, and the question of the place of Rohingya in the country's future pushed to the fore in a way that it had not been in 2010, when the major issue in Rakhine State was Chinese exploitation of natural resources and designs on the Bay of Bengal. At that time, as I recall, hearing when I was there, and I arrived in October of 2010, just before the elections, the major issue there was not a question of enfranchising Rohingya or counting them as citizens. It was the issue of Chinese projects in the region, which have become completely sidelined, of course, since the outbreak of violence in 2012 and the controversy following that over Rohingya participation in the abortive constitutional referendum ahead of the general election in 2015.
So what can we learn from this terrible, terrible state of affairs? What can we learn from the experience of the Rohingya about elections in Myanmar and about the hybrid civilian military regime?
Well, I think it really underscores the fact that there are no rights in Myanmar. Nobody's rights are secure or guaranteed. And the Rohingya are a sort of limit case in that. But if you look at the way that people across the country are treated, obviously, both people who are considered to be a member of the national race, one of the 135 national races, that it's very clear that rights, there is no rule of law. Despite all of the rhetoric about the establishing rule of law, we have not seen under this government any really substantive progress towards that. And it's debatable whether or not that is even possible under a hybrid system where one of the main institutions of the state, the military, is unaccountable to an elected legislature and a civilian government. But participation in these elections, I think, is consequential for the various Rohingya politicians who are now calling for it, not necessarily because of its possibility of being included in meaningfully the elections, because that seems very remote. But there is a symbolic significance, a legitimacy that is conferred by seeing in the public eye to be able to participate and stand for elections. And even if Rohingya were able to be elected, they would, of course, still be in a very, very small minority and unlikely to be able to align themselves very effectively with any political party to affect legislative change. But they would have a platform from which to advocate for their interests with the legitimacy that comes from having been elected. So certainly being included in democratic processes is vitally important to the question of, Rohingya leadership, and which I think is an important issue that gets glossed over, because right now there is a lot of uncertainty in the matter of who leads the Rohingya. You have a group of people who were elected in 1990 who remain very influential and important to Rohingya as leaders, but you haven't had the opportunity really for democratic legitimacy to be conferred to Rohingya leadership in this way for some time, certainly since 2015. Meanwhile, you have had a number of leaders emerge from the Rohingya diaspora in other parts of the world, and they have taken on an increasingly significant and influential and important leadership role. But absent these kinds of institutional mechanisms to afford them a democratic basis to say, well, I was elected, as members from the DHRP were, say, in the 1990 election. And that legitimacy has resonated across, since 1990. And the people who were elected in that election retained their position as very influential and consequential leaders because they can point to having been elected by Rohingya in Rakhine State, in the majority Rohingya districts there. So there is definitely a power that comes with being able to point to a popular basis for your role as a leader. And unfortunately, it seems very unlikely that that opportunity will be extended in this coming election. Although even an NLD spokesperson recently, saying they were speaking in a personal capacity, said that Rohingya were right to pursue that right to participate in the election. But I think there aren't any illusions on amongst anybody really about the practical prospects of that materializing under this current government. I think the most that we might hope for is to see that they will actually include Muslim candidates. And already there have been some Muslim candidates who come forward to say they're going to contest the election, a number of them. And they're pushing for inclusion in the election. And that will be an important test of the current government's commitment to democracy. I think, though, the real best outcome that we're going to see here possibly is just Muslim candidates being able to run at all. I mean, it's going to be a very incremental improvement on that front. It'll be quite something if any Muslim candidates actually are elected and able to take seats in either regional or state or national level parliaments. Because I think that we're not going to see, and we haven't seen, any indication from the NLD, this NLD government, of changing course on the question of whether or not the Rohingya have a rightful place in Myanmar and have any rightful place in determining its future. The NLD has been very consistent in backing up the hard line nationalist view that the Rohingya are not legitimate subjects or citizens, and that they have no right to claim one, even. So the country has really been galvanized around this question, and I haven't seen at any point any indication whatsoever that NLD leadership is softening on that point. Now, what we might see, perhaps, is some of the three different parties that have, at different points, sought to represent Rohingya interests in various elections change their position, or at least take a softer approach to the question of using the term Rohingya in politics. I've already seen some indication that some of these parties are now suggesting that they represent Muslims rather than Rohingya. So it's possible that there is some space for these three different parties and the NLD to work out some kind of compromise whereby candidates from these parties who are running as Muslims rather than as Rohingya, which in the past, Rohingya candidates from these parties were rejected on the basis that their parents were not citizens, despite having formerly been elected and been able to run. And so there were a small number of candidates who were basically allowed to run because they had Buddhist parents on one side and so on, that they were able to establish some kind of, in the eyes of the legal system there, a claim to being, citizens, full citizens. But that has been denied to most of the candidates from these parties in the last cycle. So I don't know that that's going to change in this election, that you will see anyone who is identifying as Rohingya, who has paperwork or has a record of having been elected. I don't think that there will be any change to their prospects to being able to contest the election. I think the best case might be that there will be folks in these parties who have other bases for asserting their citizenship who will be able to contest the election. Whether or not they'll actually win is a very difficult question to answer, given that their constituencies are now largely, at least from Rakhine State, are now in exile in refugee camps. So there are Rohingya, of course, in places other than northern Rakhine State, but whether or not they will be able to form and constitute enough of a voting bloc to elect any Muslim candidate to parliament is, whether that's, again, regional or national, I think is a very difficult question to answer at this point. I think it's unlikely. I think that the most we're going to hope for here, best case scenario, is to see Muslim candidates be able to contest seats.
It would be remiss of us not to discuss the role of ARSO, the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, which is the militant organisation that precipitated the brutal response from the Myanmar military that led to 800,000 or more Rohingya leaving their homes in 2017. So how do they play into this? What is ARSO's role in facilitating or obstructing the democratic participation of the Rohingya?
Yeah, obviously the role of ARSO is a very sensitive and complicated topic, especially with respect to these elections. There was a fatwa issued against, not by name, but against ARSO. And in that fatwa, a group of 47 Rohingya religious authorities called for the election of an emir, the election of a leader for Rohingya people. And unfortunately, that fatwa was basically undermined and disregarded by ARSO. And elections in the camps have been geared towards choosing people who can help UN agencies operate the camps more effectively. But the political realities of the Rohingya being in Bangladesh, where they do not have legal protections as refugees, since Bangladesh is not a signatory to the Convention on the Rights of Refugees, there has been no real concerted effort to constitute any kind of sovereign Rohingya authority through democratic processes. It's been localized to the camps and hasn't had a broader scope in terms of creating a democratically legitimate governing body or representatives for Rohingya refugees or Rohingya more generally. And that's a very difficult question, considering you have Rohingya inside Myanmar still. So you have, people spread out all over the world in different countries within the diaspora. And if you were to try to implement something like having an elected body or elected representatives for Rohingya writ large, it would get into very complicated questions of who really is Rohingya and who belongs to this larger diaspora. Since you've got 500,000 Rohingya in Saudi Arabia, you have many, a large number in Pakistan and Malaysia and other places. But the role of ARSO in all of this is decidedly unhelpful. They are not serving the interests of democratic representation of Rohingya in any way, shape, or form. They operate decidedly undemocratically and have really undermined the cause of inclusion of Rohingya within democratic processes more broadly by appealing to authority that is more similar in the way it operates to the kind of dictatorship under which Rohingya have suffered for decades.
Could it be argued that as a consequence of the Rohingya community's lack of representation, lack of self-realization and participation in any kind of meaningful polity, a consequence of that could be increased militarism? It could be, from the Myanmar side, a ticking time bomb of further intractable ethnic conflict, something that Myanmar's not exactly alien to.
Right. Now, from the point of view of the Myanmar government, I suppose the question is who they want to engage with. Do they want to engage with Rohingya leaders who have the legitimacy that of being elected in a process that Myanmar itself has organized, or do they want to contend with basically a group that is forming or attempting to form a stronger position as unelected representatives of Rohingya, particularly those who are now trapped in refugee camps in Bangladesh, because those do seem to be the sort of at least two of the most likely kind of possibilities here. You can either work with leadership that is accountable to an electorate through transparent democratic processes, or you will have a continued issue of dealing with a group that is entirely unaccountable to any kind of through any kind of democratic processes or rule of law. ARSO is not not promoting the interests of democracy in the way that it operates, and it's really operating in a very different kind of approach than Rohingya leaders who want to be included in democratic processes within Myanmar. So going forward, there's not going to be a lot of middle ground between those two possibilities. There are groups in the camp, the Arakan Rohingya Society for Peace and Human Rights. ARSPH is one of the organizations in the camps that has been very active in trying to get representation at the level of dealing with camp agencies and also dealing with states like Bangladesh. They've been very active in trying to develop Rohingya interests and a voice from the camps. But this is in a context where ARSO is effectively operating parallel to this in a manner that is not transparent nor democratic. So there is a trajectory here in which Rohingya could be shut out of the democratic processes that are unfolding in Myanmar to the extent that they are democratic, and in which case groups, or rather ARSO in particular, will have a stronger case to say, well, this other path isn't working. It isn't leading anywhere. It isn't resulting in any concrete results. And the militancy could very well rise and support for ARSO increase.
Okay, thanks, Kirt. That's wonderful. I think that gives a really good overview and a really good context to what is happening with the Rohingya and this election, and perhaps the broader political dimensions surrounding ethnicity behind these elections. Your work with the Rohingya is really fantastic, and I just want to ask now, before we move to recommendations, how is this directly related to your actual PhD, which, as we know, needs to be a very narrow topic. You're just getting started at University of California, Berkeley. What are you going to be researching for the next several years?
Well, my research interests actually are less focused on these sorts of questions about politics in the sense of inclusion in state processes. My PhD research focuses on Rohingya scripts, digital diaspora, and ethnogenesis, how Rohingya identities are established, maintained, and contested through digitally mediated representations of Rohingya language. I'm interested in how a global diaspora is taking to virtual spaces, some of the only spaces in which Rohingya, many of whom have been resettled now in third countries, may have grown up in these places, how they use these spaces to interact with Rohingya who may be in the camps, although access to internet there is a big complicating factor. So I'm interested in how a predominantly visual media, social media and other new media, are shaping an emergent digital diaspora with a focus on different written representations of Rohingya dialects. I'm interested to explore ethnogenesis, that is, how, in this context of the annihilation, persecution of Rohingya, how Rohingya themselves are forming their own identity for themselves, not with respect to whether or not they meet the legal categories of citizenship and so on.
Fascinating, and a really good topic methodologically for these times when so many of us are stranded and kind of forced to look at the digital.
Well, I have been known to spend a fair amount of time myself in these kinds of spaces, so I am trying to draw on my lived experience as well, but it is suitable to the current unfortunate situation we're all in.
Yeah. All right. And the final thing to wrap up the podcast is to ask you for your recommendations. 3.5 years on since you last gave listeners recommendations. What do you think people should be reading, listening to, eating to do with Myanmar, or perhaps to do with the Rohingya?
Well, since we last spoke, when I was still living in Myanmar before being indefinitely banned from returning, there have been a number of papers and books that have been published on this issue that I think are certainly well worth attending to. There's been a second edition of Francis Wade's book, and Carlos Sariña Galache has released a book. And in the future, Ronan Lee, his book is coming out soon. There's also been a book by John Holt on this crisis. So there's been a real kind of flourishing of academic sources. Elliot Press Freeman has published a number of very pertinent and germane articles that are insightful on the issue. So I've been really, and these are just a handful. There's a growing field of Rohingya scholars and scholars who are Rohingya themselves. Zia Rahman has a memoir that has been released. Mayu Ali, a very well-known Rohingya poet, has published his work, which of course is reflective of his own experience as a refugee. Yeah, I think we will see more personal accounts and we'll hear more directly from Rohingya voices, which should be the central focus of our attention at any rate. It's very important to emphasize that our attention should be squarely on the voices of Rohingya themselves in seeking to understand their situation and their experience of this genocide. So perhaps the brightest news related to all of this is that the possibility of wrapping our heads around what's happening has been expanded, but unfortunately, the situation for Rohingya themselves has not been quite as bright. That seems to be on the wrong track, I think, certainly.
Well, I hope that your friends and contacts in the camps in Bangladesh are safe and well during this COVID-19 pandemic. And thank you very much for coming on Myanmar Musings.
Thank you very much, Luke. It's been a pleasure to be back.